The knife came out of the dark before Edmund even heard footsteps. He turned his shoulder just in time, and the blade tore through his coat instead of his ribs. The man behind him grunted in surprise, and Edmund used that half-second to drive his elbow back into the attacker's face. Bone cracked against bone. The man staggered into the stable wall, and Edmund pressed forward, pinning his arm before the knife could rise again. "Who sent you?" Edmund said, his voice low and steady, though his heart was slamming against his chest. The man said nothing. He only laughed, a wet, broken sound, before going still in a way that told Edmund he would say nothing more. Not now, not ever. Edmund released him, and stepped back, breathing hard, staring down at the stranger who had waited for him in the shadows of his own stable yard. This was the third attempt in 2 months. He wiped the blade clean on the grass, tucked it into his belt, and looked up at the tall windows of Collingford Hall glowing faintly with candlelight. Somewhere behind one of those windows, his wife was likely still awake, waiting for him the way she always did, not knowing how close he had just come to never returning to her at all. Edmund Ashworth, Duke of Collingford, had married Eleanor Whitmore only 4 months earlier, and in that short time he had come to feel something for her he had never expected to feel for anyone. It should have been simple. Their fathers had arranged the match years before either of them had a voice in the matter, a joining of 2 old families to settle old debts and secure new alliances. Edmund had gone into the marriage prepared to be polite, distant, dutiful. He had not gone into it prepared to watch Eleanor laugh at something foolish he said, and feel his whole chest go warm and unguarded. He had not prepared for any of this, not for the danger circling him now, and certainly not for how much he had grown to care for the woman sleeping under his roof. He walked the long path back toward the house, his boots crunching over gravel, his mind turning over the same questions that had haunted him for weeks. Someone wanted him dead. He had enemies, of course. Every duke did. Men who envied his title or resented decisions made by his father before him. But this was different. This was patient, deliberate, and it was getting closer to succeeding every time. He entered through the side door, careful not to wake the household, and found Eleanor sitting by the fire in the small parlor near the stairs, a book open and forgotten in her lap. She looked up the moment he stepped inside, and her eyes went straight to the tear in his coat. "Edmund." She rose so quickly the book slid to the floor. "What happened?" "Nothing," he said, too fast, and she did not believe him for a second. She crossed the room and took his face in her hands, tilting it toward the candlelight, checking for injury the way she always did, as though she could not quite trust him to tell her the truth. He let her look. He let her fingers brush the small cut above his eyebrow that he had not even noticed until now. "Someone attacked you," she said quietly. It was not a question. Edmund exhaled and sat down heavily in the chair she had just left. "Someone has been trying to attack me for some time now, Eleanor. This is not the first." Her face went pale, but she did not weep or panic the way he had half expected. Instead, she sat across from him, her spine straight, her hands folded tightly in her lap, and said, "Then you will tell me everything, from the beginning, and we will decide together what must be done." It was, Edmund thought, exactly the kind of thing his wife would say. In the months since their wedding, he had learned that Eleanor was not the quiet, decorative bride he had expected from an arranged match. She had opinions, and she was not afraid to share them. She managed the household accounts better than his own steward. She read newspapers most ladies of her station never touched, and she asked sharp questions about politics and land and money that made other men at dinner parties shift uncomfortably in their seats. He loved that about her. He had realized it slowly, over quiet breakfasts and long evening walks through the gardens, until one day he woke and understood that the arrangement his father had made for him had somehow become the truest thing in his life. That was precisely why he could not tell her everything. "There is nothing to decide," he said carefully. "I have hired more men to guard the grounds. I will be more careful." "That is not an answer, Edmund. It is the only one I can give you tonight." She studied him for a long moment, and he could see the hurt flicker behind her eyes before she carefully hid it away, the way she had learned to do in the early days of their marriage, when he had still kept her at arm's length out of habit rather than choice. He hated putting that look back on her face now, after everything. "You forget," she said softly, "that I am your wife. Whatever threatens you threatens this house, and threatens me. I have a right to know." "You have every right," he agreed. "And I promise you will know." when it is safe for you to know." It was a foolish thing to say, the kind of sentence a man says when he is trying to protect someone by keeping her blind. And some part of him understood even as he said it, that it would not satisfy her. But his mind was already racing ahead, past this conversation, toward the letter that had arrived that very morning, tucked beneath his breakfast plate where only he would find it. The letter had no signature. It had simply said that his family line would end with him, one way or another, and that those closest to him would suffer for his father's old sins. He had burned it in the fireplace before Eleanor came down to breakfast. Now, sitting across from her, watching the firelight catch the gold in her hair, Edmund made a decision that would haunt him for years afterward. He decided that the only way to keep her safe was to keep her away from him entirely, at least until he understood who wanted him dead and why. He told himself it was the noble choice, the choice a man made when he loved someone more than his own comfort. He did not yet know that Eleanor had a secret of her own, one that would make his decision far crueler than he intended. 3 days earlier, Eleanor had visited the physician in the village under the guise of a headache that would not pass. She had returned home with a piece of knowledge she had not yet found the courage to share with her husband, a piece of knowledge that filled her with both joy and a strange, quiet fear she could not name. She was carrying his child. She had wanted to wait for the right moment to tell him, a quiet evening without worry hanging over them, a moment she could keep forever in her memory. Watching him now, tense and guarded, and clearly hiding something serious, she understood that moment had not yet come, and she would have to wait a little longer. "Come to bed," she said instead, standing and holding out her hand. "Whatever this is, it will still be there in the morning, and you look as though you have not slept properly in a week." He took her hand, grateful for the small mercy of her not pressing further, and followed her up the stairs, past the portraits of dukes who had come before him, men who had faced their own dangers and their own choices. He wondered, walking past their painted faces, what any of them would have done in his place. He wondered if love had ever made cowards of better men than himself. That night, as Eleanor slept beside him, Edmund lay awake staring at the ceiling, turning over every possibility in his mind. He thought of his father, dead 6 years now, and the old rivalries the man had left behind like unexploded traps scattered across Edmund's inheritance. He thought of Lord Grantham Vale, a neighboring nobleman whose family had lost land and standing, decades ago, in a dispute with Edmund's grandfather, a grudge that seemed to have passed down through generations like a poisoned inheritance. He thought of the assassin in the stable yard, dead now, taking his secrets with him. By the time dawn broke pale and gray over the hills beyond Collingford Hall, Edmund had made his decision. He would send Eleanor away, somewhere safe, somewhere far from whatever storm was gathering around his name. He would tell her it was temporary. He would tell himself the same thing, though some quiet, honest part of him already feared it might not be true. He did not yet know about the child. He did not yet know that by choosing to protect her with distance, he was about to make the greatest mistake of his life, one that would cost him years he could never get back, and a truth he would not learn until it was almost too late to matter. Downstairs, the fire had burned down to embers, and outside, in the gray light before sunrise, a rider was already approaching the gates of Collingford Hall, carrying a message that would change everything Edmund thought he understood about the danger closing in around his family. The rider was one of Edmund's own men, sent days earlier to look into the history of the threats, and the message he carried made Edmund's blood run cold before he had even finished reading it. Lord Grantham Vale had been seen meeting privately with 2 men known for hire in matters of violence, men who had vanished from the county the very night of the stable-yard attack. Edmund read the letter twice at his desk, then folded it and pressed his palm flat against the wood, as though he could steady his racing thoughts through touch alone. Vale. Of course it was Vale. The man had spent years smiling politely at dinners and balls while nursing a grievance passed down from his grandfather, a grievance over land that had once belonged to the Vale family before a legal dispute stripped it away and handed it to the Ashworth line instead. Edmund had always found the old feud tiresome, a relic of a world that no longer mattered. He understood now, far too late, that Vale had never let it go. He called for his steward, a steady, quiet man named Henry Fairfax, who had served the Ashworth family since Edmund was a boy learning to ride. Henry arrived within minutes, his expression already grave, as though he sensed the weight of what was coming. "You have heard," Edmund said. I have, Your Grace. The rider spoke to me first. Then you understand why I must act quickly. Henry hesitated, choosing his words with the care of a man who had known Edmund long enough to speak plainly when it mattered. I understand your fear for the Duchess, Your Grace. I am not certain I understand the plan forming behind your eyes right now, and I confess it worries me. Edmund almost smiled at that, despite everything. Henry had always been able to read him too well. I intend to send her to her aunt's estate in the north, far from Vale's reach, far from whatever comes next. And what will you tell her? The truth, as much of it as I can bear to share. That there is danger, and that I need her away from it while I deal with the matter. Henry's jaw tightened. Forgive me for speaking so directly, Your Grace, but the Duchess is not a woman who will simply accept being sent away without a fuller explanation. She has proven herself sharper than most men at your dinner table. I know that better than anyone, Edmund said quietly, but I would rather endure her anger than bury her. The words hung heavy in the study, and Henry said nothing more, only nodded and excused himself to begin making arrangements for the journey north. Edmund remained at his desk long after the door closed, staring at the folded letter, feeling the walls of his carefully built happiness beginning to crack apart around him. He found Eleanor in the garden that afternoon, cutting late roses for the dining table, her sleeves rolled to the elbow and a basket balanced on her hip. She looked so at ease, so entirely unaware of the storm gathering around them, that for a moment, Edmund considered saying nothing at all, simply enjoying one more ordinary afternoon before everything changed. But he had never been a man who could hide from difficult conversations for long, whatever his other failings, and so he crossed the lawn toward her and said her name. She turned, smiling, until she saw his face, and the smile faded into careful attention. You look as though you are about to tell me something I will not like. I am sending you to your aunt's estate, he said, deciding that directness was the only kindness he had left to offer. For your safety, until this matter with Lord Vale is settled. Eleanor set down her basket slowly, the roses forgotten. Lord Vale. He is behind the attacks. I have proof enough to be certain of it, though not enough yet to bring before the magistrate. Then let me help you gather that proof, she said, stepping closer, her voice rising with a determination he recognized, and in other circumstances, might have admired. I know his wife. I have dined at their table. I could learn things from her that your men never could. Absolutely not. The words came out harder than he intended, and he saw her flinch slightly before covering it with pride. Eleanor, I will not use you as a spy against a man who has already sent someone to kill me in my own stable yard. And I will not simply be packed away like a piece of furniture while my husband faces danger alone, she shot back, her chin lifting in the way it did whenever she refused to be dismissed. We are meant to face things together, Edmund. That is what marriage means, is it not? Even one arranged the way ours was. Her words struck somewhere deep in his chest, somewhere he had not expected to feel pain of this particular kind. He wanted, desperately, to agree with her, to pull her into the fight beside him, and trust that together they could outwit Vale and his hired men. But every instinct he possessed screamed against it. He had already watched one attacker die in front of him this week. He would not risk her becoming the next target simply because she wished to prove her courage. I cannot lose you, he said finally, quietly, all the fight draining out of his voice. Do you understand that? I have lost people before, Eleanor. My father, my mother before him. I have learned to carry loss and keep moving forward, but I do not believe I could survive losing you. Not now, not after everything. For a moment, something softened in her expression, and he thought perhaps he had reached her. Then her eyes hardened again, though gentler this time, sadder. Then let me stay and help you survive this, rather than sending me away to survive it without you. I cannot risk it. You are not the only one capable of making that choice for yourself. They stood facing each other in the garden, the afternoon sun catching the last of the roses, two people who had grown to love each other more deeply than either had expected, now standing on opposite sides of a decision that neither could fully bend to the other's will. Edmund felt the weight of his title pressing down on him in that moment, the responsibility of protecting not just his own life, but hers, the future of his family name, the tenants who depended on Callingford's stability. He could not explain all of that to her in a garden full of roses. He could only make the choice and hope, someday, she would understand it had come from love rather than mistrust. "You leave in 3 days," he said. "I have already sent word to your aunt." Eleanor's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall, and she turned away from him, gathering her basket with hands that trembled only slightly. "You might have asked me, Edmund, before deciding my life for me. I am asking you now." "No," she said, walking past him, toward the house. "You are telling me there is a difference, and I think you know it." He watched her go, her back straight, despite the hurt he knew he had caused, and he wanted to call after her, to explain everything, the letters, the threats, the fear that had kept him awake for weeks. But he said nothing, because saying nothing felt, in that terrible moment, like the only way to keep her from arguing her way into danger. That evening, dinner passed in careful, polite silence, the kind that exists between two people who love each other too much to shout and are too hurt to speak warmly. Eleanor picked at her food and answered his questions with short, correct sentences, and Edmund found himself wishing for the easy laughter of only a few nights before, when none of this had yet fallen upon them. Later, alone in her chamber, Eleanor sat by her window and pressed a hand against her still flat stomach, thinking of the child growing quietly within her, a child Edmund did not yet know existed. She had planned to tell him that very week, in a quiet moment free of shadows and fear. Now she found herself wondering whether telling him would only give him one more reason to send her away, to protect her and the child with distance rather than closeness. She decided, in the end, to say nothing. If he was determined to separate from her without full honesty about the danger he faced, then perhaps she, too, was entitled to a secret of her own, at least until she understood his reasons more fully. It was not a decision made from spite, but from a raw, aching hurt that made her want to protect this small, private joy from a husband who seemed determined to keep her at a distance during the very moment she wanted him closest. It was, though she could not have known it then, the decision that would shape the next several years of both their lives. The 3 days before her departure passed in a strange, careful truce. Edmund spent long hours locked away with Henry Fairfax and 2 men from London hired to investigate Lord Vale's movements more thoroughly. Eleanor spent her days packing, writing letters to her aunt, and walking the grounds of Collingford Hall as though trying to memorize every stone and tree before leaving them behind. On the final evening, Edmund found her in the small parlor again, exactly where he had found her the night of the attack, a book open and unread in her lap. He sat across from her without a word, and for a long while neither of them spoke. "I am not sending you away because I do not love you," he said finally. "I am sending you away because I love you more than I know how to say, and I cannot think clearly while you are within reach of the danger surrounding me." Eleanor closed her book slowly. "And I am not angry because I doubt your love, Edmund. I am angry because you have decided, without me, what shape that love should take. Perhaps we are both a little foolish," he said, and something like a small, sad smile crossed his face. "Perhaps," she agreed, and reached across the space between them to take his hand. The first tender gesture either had allowed themselves in 3 days. "Promise me you will write. Promise me you will tell me the moment this danger has passed, and not a day later, out of some misguided wish, to spare me further worry." "I promise," he said, and in that moment, he meant it fully, with every part of himself. Neither of them could have known how difficult that promise would become to keep, nor how many months would pass before either learned the full truth the other was carrying quietly inside. The next morning, a carriage waited in the drive, and Edmund walked Eleanor to it himself, his hand at the small of her back, his throat tight with words he could not quite find the courage to say. At the carriage door, she turned to him one last time. "Take care of yourself," she said softly. "I intend to come home to a husband who is still breathing, Edmund Ashworth, and I will not forgive you easily if you fail me in that regard." "I will do everything in my power," he promised. She climbed into the carriage, and as it pulled away down the long drive, Edmund stood watching until it disappeared entirely from view, unaware that somewhere behind him, one of the men he had hired to protect his estate was, in that very moment, receiving a message of his own, one that would reveal betrayal far closer to home than either the Duke or the Duchess yet suspected. The man who received the message was named Oliver Grant, one of the guards Edmund had personally hired to patrol the outer grounds of Collingford Hall. He read the note by lantern light in the small room above the stables, his hands steady despite the weight of what he was being asked to do. The note offered him more money than he would earn in 5 years of honest work, in exchange for information about the Duke's movements, his schedule, the weak points in his security. It did not ask him to harm anyone directly. It only asked him to watch, and to report, and to stay silent. Oliver told himself this made it acceptable. He had a sister with a sickness that ate away at her lungs a little more each year, and medicine cost more than his wages could ever provide. He told himself that watching and reporting was different from wielding a blade himself, that whatever happened afterward would not truly be his doing. He burned the note in the lantern flame and told himself, one more time, that he was simply a man trying to save his sister, nothing more sinister than that. He did not yet know how deeply he would come to regret that choice, nor how much blood would eventually trace back to the moment he first agreed. Eleanor's carriage traveled north for 3 long days, rattling over roads that grew rougher the further they moved from Collingford's well-kept lands. She spent much of the journey staring out the window at unfamiliar countryside, her mind circling endlessly around the argument in the garden, the careful tenderness of their final evening, and the secret she still carried, silent and growing, beneath her traveling gown. Her aunt, Lady Constance Winthrop, welcomed her with open arms, and a house full of warmth that Eleanor had not realized she needed until she stepped through the door. Constance was her mother's sister, a widow who had chosen independence over remarriage after her husband's death, and she possessed a sharp wit and sharper eyes that missed very little. "You are pale, my dear," Constance observed within the first hour of Eleanor's arrival, studying her over the rim of a teacup, paler than mere travel would account for. Eleanor considered lying, then decided against it. If she could not trust her own aunt with this news, she could trust no one at all. "I am with child," she admitted quietly. Constance set down her teacup with careful precision. "And does the Duke know?" "No," Eleanor said, and to her own surprise, her voice broke slightly on the single word. "He sent me away before I found the courage to tell him. There is danger surrounding him, Aunt Constance, threats against his life, and he decided the safest course was to separate us entirely, rather than face it together. And you decided, in turn, not to tell him what you carry." "I was hurt," Eleanor admitted, "and afraid that if he knew, he would only find one more reason to keep me at a distance, rather than trusting me as an equal partner in whatever trouble he faces." Constance studied her niece for a long moment, her expression unreadable. "Pride is a dangerous companion in matters of the heart, Eleanor. It has a way of growing heavier the longer it is carried, until eventually it becomes too heavy to set down at all." "I know," Eleanor whispered. "I simply do not yet know how to set it down." "Then we shall have time to think on it together," Constance said, reaching across to squeeze her niece's hand. "You are safe here, whatever else is true. That much I can promise you." Eleanor settled into her aunt's household over the following weeks, and if the servants noticed the careful way she began avoiding heavy lifting, or the mornings she disappeared to be sick before breakfast, none of them spoke of it beyond the household walls. Constance made certain of that, quietly instructing her staff toward discretion, without ever explaining precisely why it mattered so much. Meanwhile, at Collingford Hall, Edmund threw himself into the investigation of Lord Vale with an intensity that worried even Henry Fairfax. He hired additional men from London, experienced in matters of both law and quieter, more discreet inquiry. He reviewed decades of old family correspondence, searching for the exact nature of the grievance that had apparently festered in the Vale family for 2 generations, hoping to understand his enemy well enough to anticipate his next move. What he found disturbed him more than he expected. The original dispute had not simply been about land, as family legend suggested, but about a betrayal, an old accusation that Edmund's grandfather had cheated Vale's grandfather in a business arrangement, stripping him not just of land, but of standing within their social circle. Whether the accusation had been true or false, Edmund could not say with certainty from the yellowed letters alone, but he understood, reading them, why the wound had never fully healed. Grantham Vale had grown up hearing stories of his family's humiliation at Ashworth hands, and somewhere along the way, that inherited resentment had curdled into something far more dangerous than mere dislike. "He believes he is owed something," Edmund said to Henry one evening, the old letters spread across his desk, like fragments of a puzzle he was only beginning to understand. "Not just an apology, restitution, perhaps even blood. Do you believe your grandfather's actions were justified?" Henry asked carefully. Edmund considered the question longer than he expected to. I believe my grandfather was not always an honest man. I believe there is likely truth buried somewhere in Vale's grievance, however twisted it has become over the years. But I also believe that whatever happened between our grandfathers is no justification for hired blades in my stable yard, nor for threats against a wife who has done nothing but marry into a family she did not choose. Then what will you do? I will find proof strong enough to bring before the magistrate, Edmund said, his jaw set with determination. And if that fails, I will find another way to end this, whatever it costs me. It was during this period of intense investigation that Edmund wrote his first letter to Eleanor, 3 weeks after her departure. He filled it with careful, guarded language, telling her he missed her more than he had expected, that the investigation progressed slowly but steadily, that he hoped to have this matter resolved within a few more months at most. He did not mention Vale by name, fearing the letter might be intercepted. He did not mention the old family scandal he had uncovered, fearing it would only worry her further. He closed the letter simply, telling her he thought of her every evening when the house grew quiet, and that he counted the days until it was safe for her to return home. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before folding it carefully and placing it in a small wooden box beside her bed, where she had already begun keeping the few possessions that felt most precious to her. She wrote back the same evening, her own letter equally careful, equally guarded, mentioning nothing of the growing evidence of her pregnancy, nor the quiet ache of missing him that grew stronger, rather than weaker, with each passing week. She told herself she would tell him soon. She told herself the right moment would arrive naturally, in his next letter perhaps, or the one after that. But each time she sat down with pen in hand, the words seemed to catch somewhere behind her ribs, tangled up with hurt pride and lingering resentment over how quickly he had chosen distance over partnership. And so the weeks continued to pass, letter after careful letter exchanged between them, both filled with genuine affection, and both carefully avoiding the 2 greatest truths each of them carried. Back at Collingford, the investigation reached a turning point when one of Edmund's hired men from London discovered that Oliver Grant, one of the estate's own guards, had been seen meeting privately with a stranger in the village tavern on 3 separate occasions. Edmund confronted Henry with the news immediately, his fury barely contained. "One of my own men," he said, pacing the length of his study. "Feeding information to Vale from inside my own household. We do not yet know for certain," Henry cautioned. "It may be entirely innocent." "Bring him to me," Edmund said. "I will know within minutes whether it is innocent or not." Oliver Grant was brought to the study that same evening, his face pale, his hands trembling slightly as he stood before the Duke he had betrayed. Edmund studied him in silence for a long moment before speaking. "You have been meeting with a stranger in the village," Edmund said quietly. "I would like to know why." Oliver's composure cracked almost immediately, and the whole story spilled out of him in a rush of shame and desperation. The sick sister, the desperate need for money, the assurance that he was only asked to watch and report, never to cause harm directly. Edmund listened to all of it without interrupting, his anger slowly giving way to something more complicated, a mixture of disgust and, despite everything, a grudging understanding of the impossible position poverty and illness could force upon a desperate man. "You understand," Edmund said finally, "that your reports may have contributed to attempts on my life, that the man you have been feeding information to intends to see me dead, and quite possibly my wife along with me, should she ever stand between him and his goal." "I did not know," Oliver whispered, tears finally breaking free. "I swear to you, Your Grace, I did not know it had gone so far." Edmund considered his options carefully. He could turn Oliver over to the magistrate immediately, ensuring punishment, but losing any chance of using the man's position to his own advantage. Or he could offer a different path entirely, one that might finally give him the proof he needed to end this threat once and for all. "I will make you an offer," Edmund said. "You will continue meeting with Vale's man, but you will report to him only what I instruct you to say. In exchange, I will personally see that your sister receives proper medical care, and I will petition for leniency regarding your betrayal, provided you help me end this threat, rather than prolong it." Oliver stared at him, stunned by the mercy being offered where he had expected none. "Why would you do this for me, after what I have done?" "Because I understand desperation," Edmund said quietly, "even when it leads good men toward terrible choices. And because I need someone inside Vale's confidence, far more than I need the satisfaction of seeing you punished." Oliver agreed immediately, gratitude and shame warring across his features, and over the following weeks, he became an unwitting weapon in Edmund's hands, feeding carefully constructed false information back to Vale's contact, while gathering real intelligence about the true scope of Vale's plans. Slowly, painstakingly, the picture began to sharpen. Vale was not merely seeking Edmund's death out of old family grievance. He intended to seize Collingford's lands entirely, using old legal documents he claimed proved fraudulent dealing by Edmund's grandfather. Documents he planned to present to the courts the moment Edmund's line ended and the estate fell into legal uncertainty. It was, Edmund realized with growing horror, an even more elaborate scheme than he had first imagined, one that explained why Vale seemed so patient, so willing to wait and plan rather than strike quickly and decisively. He wanted not just revenge, but everything Edmund possessed, and he intended to take it through the courts as easily as through violence, whichever path proved more effective. Edmund wrote to Eleanor that week with more warmth than he had allowed himself in previous letters, feeling for the first time since her departure that he might actually be gaining ground against the shadow that had driven him to send her away. He told her he hoped to have real answers within a matter of weeks, that he missed her laughter more than he knew how to properly express in writing, that he thought often of the day he could finally bring her home. Eleanor read this letter sitting in her aunt's garden, one hand resting instinctively over the gentle curve that had begun to show beneath her clothing, a curve she could no longer easily hide from the sharper-eyed members of Constance's household staff. She smiled at his words, feeling the familiar ache of missing him intensify, rather than ease, and for the first time since her arrival, she seriously considered writing back the full truth at last. She began the letter that very evening. She wrote 3 full pages describing the pregnancy, her fears, her hopes, the quiet joy that had grown alongside her worry over the months of separation. She wrote of how much she wished he were there to share in the discovery, how many nights she had lain awake wondering how he would react to the news. And then, staring at the finished letter in the candlelight, old fears rose up once more, whispering that if he knew, he might insist she remain in hiding even longer, might use the pregnancy as one more reason to keep her at arm's length, rather than drawing her closer. She folded the letter carefully, placed it in the same wooden box beside her bed where she kept his correspondence, and did not send it. It would remain there, unsent, gathering dust alongside dozens of other letters never delivered, for far longer than either of them could have imagined that quiet autumn evening. Winter arrived early that year, wrapping the northern estate in frost, long before the leaves had finished falling, and with it came a letter that shattered whatever fragile peace Eleanor had built for herself in her aunt's quiet household. The letter was not from Edmund, but from Henry Fairfax, written in careful, worried handwriting that betrayed how difficult he had found the task of composing it. He wrote that Lord Vale had grown bolder, that a fire had broken out in the east wing of Collingford Hall under suspicious circumstances, and that although Edmund had escaped unharmed, 2 servants had been injured pulling him from the smoke in time. Henry assured her that the Duke was recovering well and had insisted she not be troubled with unnecessary worry. But Henry had decided, against his employer's wishes, that the Duchess deserved to know the truth of what was happening in her own home. Eleanor read the letter standing in the cold morning light of her aunt's breakfast room, her hands shaking so badly that Constance had to guide her gently into a chair before she could finish reading. Fear for Edmund's safety crashed over her in a wave far stronger than the pride and hurt she had been nursing for months, and in that moment, every careful reason she had constructed for staying silent about her pregnancy suddenly seemed small and foolish beside the far greater fear of losing him entirely. "I must go to him," she said, rising from the chair despite Constance's protests. "I cannot remain here, safe and comfortable, while he faces fire and blades alone." "You are carrying his child, Eleanor," Constance said firmly, taking her by the shoulders. "A dangerous journey now, could risk both your life and the child's. You must think clearly, not simply react to fear." "How can I think clearly when the man I love is being hunted?" "By trusting that he has capable men around him, and by writing to him immediately, telling him everything you have kept hidden these past months. He deserves to know what you carry, Eleanor, especially now, when the danger has grown so much greater than either of you first believed." Eleanor sat back down slowly, the fight draining out of her as the wisdom of her aunt's words settled over the panic in her chest. She spent the rest of that morning writing, finally, the letter she had begun and abandoned so many times before, pouring out every detail of the pregnancy, her fears, her hopes, and now, most urgently, her desperate need to know that he was truly safe. She sealed the letter and sent it that very afternoon by her aunt's fastest rider, praying it would reach Callingford before any further disaster could unfold. It never arrived. The rider, unfamiliar with the northern roads in winter, took a route that crossed paths, unknowingly, with one of Lord Vale's men still watching the roads between the two estates, hoping to intercept any correspondence that might reveal useful information about the Duke's movements or state of mind. The letter was stolen from the rider's satchel during a brief stop at a roadside inn, along with several coins, in what appeared to any observer as nothing more than a simple robbery. The rider, embarrassed and fearful of losing his position, never reported the theft to Lady Constance, choosing instead to quietly return home and claim the letter had been delivered successfully. Eleanor waited for a reply that would never come, her worry growing with each passing week of silence. She told herself Edmund was simply too consumed by the danger around him to write promptly, that his silence meant nothing more sinister than a busy, frightened man focused entirely on survival. She did not know that her most important letter, the one containing the truth she had withheld for so long, now lay crumpled and forgotten in the pocket of a thief who had no idea what treasure of honesty he had stolen, along with his coins. At Callingford Hall, Edmund recovered slowly from the smoke that had filled his lungs during the fire, coughing through long nights and short tempers, more determined than ever to bring Vale's scheme to a definitive end. The fire had been no accident, of that he was certain, and the investigation that followed finally produced the proof he had been searching for since the very first attack in the stable yard. One of Vale's own servants, frightened by the escalating violence and unwilling to be complicit in what increasingly looked like a plot toward murder, came forward secretly to Henry Fairfax with documents that revealed the true extent of Vale's plan. Letters written in Vale's own hand detailed his intention to eliminate Edmund entirely, whether through hired blades or engineered accidents, and to use the forged land documents immediately afterward to claim Callingford's estate through the courts, before any rightful heir could contest the matter. Edmund read through the documents in his study late into the night, Henry standing silently beside him, both men grim with the weight of what they now held in their hands. "This is enough," Edmund said finally. "This is enough to bring before the magistrate and see him hanged for conspiracy, if not worse." "Then we should act quickly," Henry urged, "before he learns his servant has betrayed him and takes more desperate measures." They moved swiftly after that, presenting the evidence to the local magistrate within days, and within a fortnight, Lord Grantham Vale was arrested at his own estate, his protests of innocence falling on ears already convinced by the weight of written evidence against him. The trial that followed was swift and thorough, and by the time the frost of winter began giving way to the first thaw of early spring, Vale had been convicted of conspiracy to commit murder and sentenced to transportation, his lands seized by the Crown as partial restitution for the damage and danger he had caused. Edmund should have felt relief wash over him the moment the sentence was announced. Instead, standing in the courtroom listening to the verdict, he felt only a hollow kind of exhaustion, the particular weariness of a man who has spent so long fighting for survival that he has forgotten how to simply live without watching every shadow for danger. He thought immediately of Eleanor, of the promise he had made her the morning she left, that he would write the moment the danger passed and bring her home without delay. He returned to Callingford Hall that same evening and sat down immediately to compose the letter he had been waiting months to write, filled with relief and longing and an apology for every week of silence the investigation had forced upon their correspondence. But even as he wrote, wondering when her most recent letters had grown fewer and shorter, he did not yet understand how much time had passed since her last true letter had reached him, nor how the theft of her most important correspondence had left both of them stranded in a fog of misunderstanding neither could see clearly through. He sent word that he would travel north himself within the week to bring her home personally, rather than trusting the matter to another letter that might go astray. It felt, to him, like the proper ending to months of fear and separation, a husband riding to reclaim his wife the moment safety allowed it. He did not know, riding north through the thawing countryside days later, that Eleanor's time was drawing near, that the child conceived in the last tender weeks before her departure was now only days from arriving, and that the woman he was racing to reunite with was, at that very moment, beginning the long and difficult labor of bringing his heir into the world without him anywhere near to witness it. Eleanor's labor began on a gray morning, with little warning, a sudden tightening low in her back that quickly deepened into pain sharp enough to bring her to her knees in her aunt's hallway. Constance summoned the midwife immediately, her own composure holding firm, even as fear for her niece flickered behind her eyes, and the household transformed within the hour into a hive of quiet, urgent activity. The labor stretched long into the night, difficult and exhausting in the way first labors often are, and Eleanor found herself, in the depths of the pain, calling for Edmund without fully realizing she was doing so. Her mind clouded by exhaustion and fear reaching instinctively for the comfort of his presence, even though he lay many miles away, entirely unaware of what was unfolding. "He is not here, my dear," Constance said gently, wiping sweat from her niece's brow. "But you are strong enough to do this without him. You have carried this child through fear and separation and uncertainty, and you will bring him into the world the same way, with strength you did not know you possessed until this very moment." Near dawn, after hours that felt to Eleanor like an eternity of pain and effort, a thin, furious cry finally broke the tense silence of the room, and the midwife lifted a small, red-faced infant into the gray morning light streaming through the window. "A son," the midwife announced, and Constance wept openly with relief and joy as she helped place the child against Eleanor's exhausted chest. Eleanor stared down at the tiny face, red and wrinkled and utterly perfect, and felt love crash over her with a force she had not fully anticipated, even after months of preparing herself for this moment. He had Edmund's dark hair already, a faint dusting of it across his small head, and something in the shape of his eyes that Eleanor recognized instantly, achingly, as belonging entirely to his father.
"William,"
she whispered, the name coming to her unbidden but certain, a name she had quietly chosen months ago without ever telling anyone, not even in her letters. "His name is William." She held her son through the remainder of that gray morning, exhausted beyond words yet unwilling to let him leave her arms even for a moment. And as the household finally began to settle into the quiet aftermath of new life, Eleanor found herself thinking, with a fresh ache of longing, of Edmund riding north at that very moment, entirely unaware that he had already become a father, entirely unaware that the truth he did not yet know had just changed everything forever. Edmund never reached his wife that spring. He was 2 days into his journey north, his horse tired beneath him and his heart lighter than it had been in months, when a rider intercepted him on the road bearing urgent news from Henry Fairfax. 2 of Lord Vale's associates, men who had escaped arrest during the initial roundup, had been spotted near the northern counties, precisely the direction Edmund was traveling, and Henry feared they intended either to free Vale during his transport to the coast, or to seek revenge against the Duke who had exposed their entire scheme. Edmund read the message twice, torn between the desperate desire to continue toward Eleanor and the sickening fear that doing so might lead danger directly to her door. He thought of the fire in the east wing, of the knife in the stable yard, of every careful step Vale had taken to reach him even inside his own home, and he understood, with a cold certainty that settled deep in his chest, that he could not risk leading armed and desperate men anywhere near the woman he loved. He turned his horse around that same afternoon, sending word ahead to Eleanor's aunt that his arrival would be delayed by urgent matters, though he was careful, even in that message, not to reveal precisely why, unwilling to frighten either woman more than necessary. It was, he told himself, only a brief delay, a matter of weeks at most, before the remaining conspirators could be located and dealt with properly. This second message, unlike Eleanor's stolen letter months earlier, did arrive at Lady Constance's estate, though it arrived nearly a week after the birth of Eleanor's son, and its careful guarded wording did nothing to ease the growing unease that had already begun taking root in Eleanor's mind. She read Edmund's brief note by candlelight, her newborn son sleeping in a cradle beside her bed, and felt something cold and frightened settle over the joy of the past week. More danger, more men willing to hurt anyone standing near her husband, and now, standing near her husband meant standing near his son as well. A tiny, defenseless life that had only just entered the world. "He says he cannot come yet," Eleanor told Constance the next morning, her voice tight with barely controlled fear. "There are more men, Aunt Constance. Vale's men, still out there, still dangerous, and Edmund fears bringing that danger here if he travels north too soon. Then perhaps it is wise that he does not, Constance said carefully, watching her niece's face for signs of the panic she could already see building behind her eyes. Wise for him, perhaps. But what of William? What if these men learn of his existence, learn that Edmund now has an heir to protect, someone even more precious to threaten than a wife alone? What if they come looking for us here, believing we are simply a duke's abandoned family, easy prey for whatever revenge they seek? Constance took her niece's hands firmly in her own. You are frightening yourself with possibilities that may never come to pass, Eleanor. Can you promise me they will not? Eleanor's voice cracked with the particular desperation of new motherhood, a fear so fierce it eclipsed every other feeling she had carried through the long months of separation. I cannot promise myself that, Aunt Constance, and I will not risk my son's safety on a promise no one can truly make. It was in the grip of this fear, still raw and exhausted from childbirth, still frightened by the theft of her own letter that she did not yet know had occurred, that Eleanor made the decision that would extend her separation from Edmund far beyond what either of them could have imagined that spring morning. She decided, with her aunt's reluctant but understanding help, that she and William would move even further from Carlingford, to a small property Constance owned along the southern coast, far from the roads Vale's remaining men were known to travel, far from any connection that might lead danger toward her son. She did not send word of this decision immediately to Edmund. Part of her reasoning was practical, a fear that any letter revealing her location might itself be intercepted by the very men she sought to hide from, the way her earlier letter had vanished without explanation. But part of her reasoning, if she was honest with herself in the quiet hours of the night, was something closer to the old hurt that had never fully healed, the memory of being sent away without full honesty, the fear that revealing William's existence now, in the midst of ongoing danger, would only give Edmund one more reason to keep his family scattered and hidden rather than reunited. She told herself she would write once she and William were safely settled in their new home, once she could be certain the letter would not fall into dangerous hands. She told herself this was wisdom rather than avoidance, protection rather than pride. She did not fully examine, in those exhausted, frightened weeks, how much those two things had become tangled together inside her, until separating them felt almost impossible. The journey south took nearly 2 weeks, slow and careful for the sake of the newborn, and by the time Eleanor and William arrived at the small coastal cottage Constance had arranged for them, staffed by only 2 trusted servants sworn to discretion, Eleanor felt as though she had crossed into an entirely different life, one built around the tiny, demanding needs of her son, rather than the aching uncertainty of her marriage. Meanwhile, Edmund spent the following months hunting down the last of Vale's associates with a grim determination that left little room for anything else. The 2 men proved harder to locate than expected, moving between hidden lodgings and false names, always one step ahead of the men Edmund sent searching for them. It was not until high summer that the last of them was finally captured, attempting to book passage on a ship bound for the continent, carrying with him documents that confirmed a final, desperate plan to burn Carlingford Hall to the ground in one last act of vengeance for Vale's conviction. Edmund stood in his study the evening the news reached him, staring at the confession the captured man had given, and felt, for the first time in nearly a year, that the danger surrounding his family had truly, finally ended. He should have felt only relief. Instead, exhaustion and a strange, hollow guilt settled over him as he thought of how many months had passed since he had last held Eleanor, how many letters between them had grown careful and distant rather than warm, how the promise he had made her the morning of her departure now felt like something spoken by an entirely different man in an entirely different life. He wrote to her that very night, his relief spilling out onto the page in words far warmer than his careful, guarded letters of previous months, telling her the danger had finally ended, that nothing now stood between them and a joyful reunion, that he intended to come for her himself the moment he received her reply confirming she was ready to return home. The letter reached Lady Constance's northern estate within days, only to find the household there greatly reduced, most of the staff dismissed or reassigned, the house itself quieter than it had been in months. The single remaining housekeeper, uncertain how to handle correspondence for a mistress who had moved on without leaving forwarding instructions for every possible sender, set the letter aside in a drawer meant for later sorting, intending to ask Lady Constance's instructions the next time she visited, a visit that, due to Constance's own busy summer of settling her niece into her new coastal home, did not occur for several more months. And so Edmund's letter of relief and reunion sat forgotten in a drawer many miles from where Eleanor now lived, joining her own unsent confession in a strange, silent collection of words neither of them would ever fully exchange, while both of them, in their separate corners of England, waited for a reply that would never come. Weeks passed into months. Edmund's letters grew increasingly worried, then increasingly hurt, as silence stretched on with no explanation. He began to wonder, in his darkest moments, whether the long separation had cooled Eleanor's feelings toward him entirely, whether she had grown accustomed to a quieter life, away from the dangers and complications of being his Duchess, whether perhaps she no longer wished to return to a marriage that had brought her so much fear and loneliness in its first year. He did not know, could not have known, that somewhere along the southern coast, his wife was raising his son alone, checking the post each week, with a hope that slowly, painfully, curdled into a resigned belief that Edmund's silence meant he had simply moved forward without her, perhaps relieved to be free of a marriage arranged for him rather than chosen, perhaps grateful for the distance that had somehow become permanent rather than temporary. Eleanor watched William grow through that first difficult year, marking each small milestone with a private, aching joy she wished desperately she could share with his father. His first smile, wide and gummy and utterly heart-melting. His first attempts to grasp at the world around him with tiny, determined fingers. The way his eyes, as he grew, deepened into the same warm brown as Edmund's, a resemblance so striking that Constance sometimes had to look away, unable to bear the sorrow of watching her niece raise a child who was, in every visible feature, a small echo of the husband she had left behind. "You must write to him properly, Eleanor," Constance said one evening, nearly a year after William's birth, watching her niece rock the sleeping child in the small parlor of their coastal cottage. "This silence between you has gone on far too long. Whatever pride or fear keeps you from it, surely it cannot outweigh the truth that a father does not know his own son exists." "I have tried," Eleanor said quietly, and it was, in its own way, true. She had begun a dozen letters over the past year, each one abandoned partway through, when old fears rose up to choke the words before they could fully form. "Each time I try, I think of how much time has already passed, how strange it will seem to reveal a son, already a year old, how he might wonder why I kept such news from him for so long, and I cannot find the courage to face that question honestly. The longer you wait," Constance said gently, "the harder that question becomes to answer. You know this, I think, even as you continue waiting." Eleanor said nothing, only held her sleeping son a little closer, watching the candlelight flicker across his small, peaceful face, and wondered, not for the first time, whether the choice she had made in fear and grief, so many months ago, had already grown into something far too large and complicated to undo. 4 years slipped by with a quiet, cruel efficiency, the kind of passage of time that feels impossible, until suddenly it has already happened, leaving behind changes too large to easily reverse. At Collingford Hall, Edmund had become, in the eyes of society, a curious sort of mystery, a duke whose wife had vanished from public life so completely that whispered theories filled ballrooms and drawing rooms across the county. Some claimed the Duchess had fled a marriage grown cold and loveless. Others whispered of illness, of madness, of scandal too shameful to speak aloud. Edmund answered none of these rumors directly, unwilling to expose the truth of Vale's conspiracy to public gossip, and his silence only fed the speculation further, until the story of the vanished Duchess had grown into something almost mythical among the county's more idle tongues. He had continued writing to her for the better part of 2 years after the danger had passed, letters growing shorter and further apart, as hope slowly wore thin against unanswered silence, until finally, sometime in the 3rd year, he had simply stopped, unable to bear the particular ache of pouring his heart onto pages that seemed to disappear into some void, never returned, never acknowledged. His extended family, meanwhile, grew increasingly insistent that he consider his position more practically. Without an heir, the dukedom's future remained uncertain, and his aging aunt, Lady Margaret Ashworth, took every opportunity to remind him of this uncomfortable truth whenever she visited Collingford Hall. "You cannot simply wait forever for a woman who has clearly chosen to remain absent from her own marriage," Margaret said one autumn afternoon, seated stiffly in the same parlor where Edmund had once found Eleanor curled with a book, years and a lifetime ago. The law provides paths forward for a man in your position, Edmund. An annulment could be sought. Given the length and nature of this separation, you could remarry, secure your line, and put this painful chapter behind you entirely. I have no interest in an annulment, Edmund said, his voice carrying a firmness that had grown sharper with each year of unexplained separation. Whatever has happened between Eleanor and myself, whatever silence has grown between us, I do not believe it releases me from the vows I made to her. Vows made to a woman who has abandoned you for years without explanation, Margaret pressed. Edmund, I understand loyalty, but there comes a point where loyalty to an absent wife becomes disloyalty to your entire family line, to the tenants who depend on stability, to the very title you carry. Edmund said nothing for a long moment, staring into the fire the way he had 100 times before across the long years of waiting. Some part of him, the practical, dutiful part that had been trained since childhood to place the dukedom above personal feeling, understood the truth in his aunt's words. Another part, quieter but far more stubborn, refused to fully believe that Eleanor's silence stemmed from abandonment rather than something he simply did not yet understand. Give me until spring, he said finally. If I have heard nothing by then, I will consider your counsel more seriously. Margaret did not look satisfied by this compromise, but she accepted it, recognizing the particular stubbornness in her nephew's expression that no amount of practical argument would easily overcome. Along the southern coast, Eleanor's life had settled into a rhythm entirely different from the one she had once imagined for herself as a young bride entering an arranged marriage. William had grown into a bright, curious child, full of questions about the world and a particular fascination with horses that reminded Eleanor, achingly, of stories Edmund had once told her about learning to ride as a boy at Collingford. She had told William, in careful, age-appropriate pieces, that his father was a duke who lived far away, dealing with important matters that kept them apart, though even to her own ears, the explanation had grown increasingly threadbare as William grew old enough to ask sharper, more persistent questions. Why does he not visit us? William asked one evening, nearly 5 years old now, his dark eyes, so like his father's, fixed on Eleanor, with the particular directness of a child who has not yet learned to soften difficult questions. Eleanor felt the familiar ache tighten in her chest, the one that had never fully faded across the years of separation. It is complicated, my darling. There were dangers, once, that kept us apart, and by the time those dangers passed, too much time had gone by, and I did not know how to explain everything properly. Does he know about me? The question landed with the particular weight of something Eleanor had been avoiding, facing directly for years, dressed up in all her careful reasoning about safety and timing, and the difficulty of explaining such a long silence. She looked at her son's earnest, questioning face and understood, with sudden painful clarity, that she owed him an honest answer, even if she could not yet act on the truth it revealed. No, she admitted softly. He does not know, William. And I think, perhaps, it is time that changed. That admission, spoken aloud to her own son rather than merely turned over in private thought, seemed to break something loose in Eleanor that had been stuck fast for years. She thought of Constance's gentle but persistent urging over the seasons, of the dozens of abandoned letters that had accumulated in the wooden box beside her bed, of the particular unfairness of allowing pride and fear to keep a father and son apart for so many years, when the original danger that had separated them had long since passed. She began, that very night, the letter she had avoided writing properly for nearly 5 years, pouring out the full truth at last, William's existence, his age, his resemblance to his father, the years of silence born first from hurt pride and later from a fear of explaining such a long-buried secret. She wrote of her love for Edmund, unchanged despite everything, and her hope, however uncertain, that enough time and distance might have softened whatever anger he carried toward her long absence into something closer to understanding. She finished the letter as dawn broke over the coastal cliffs outside her window, and this time, she did not allow herself the luxury of doubt or delay. She sealed it immediately, and rode into the nearby village herself, to ensure it was sent by the most reliable post available, unwilling to risk another lost letter, after everything the years of silence had already cost her. The letter traveled north over the following days, passing through hands and roads that, this time, carried it safely and without incident, toward Collingford Hall, arriving on a grey, unremarkable morning in early spring, precisely as the deadline Edmund had given his aunt drew close. Edmund was in his study reviewing estate accounts when Henry Fairfax, now grey at the temples and carrying himself with the particular gravity of a man who had weathered many years of watching his employer's quiet suffering, brought the letter to him personally rather than sending it through the usual channels. "This arrived by special post, Your Grace," Henry said, his voice carrying something Edmund could not quite name, a mixture of hope and caution that made Edmund's chest tighten before he had even seen the handwriting on the envelope. I recognized the hand immediately. Edmund took the letter with fingers that trembled slightly, staring at Eleanor's familiar, careful script for the first time in nearly 2 years. He broke the seal slowly, almost reverently, and began to read. He did not finish the letter standing. Somewhere in the second paragraph, his legs seemed to lose their strength entirely, and he sank into his chair, staring at words that rearranged everything he had believed about the past 5 years of his life. A son. He had a son, nearly 5 years old now, growing up along the southern coast entirely unknown to him, carrying his name and his features and years of experiences Edmund had never witnessed, never shared, never even known existed. He read the letter 3 more times, feeling something between joy and grief crash through him, in waves too large to fully process at once. Joy, fierce and overwhelming, at the existence of a child he had never dared hope for across the long years of silence. Grief, sharp and unexpected, at every moment already lost, every first step and first word and first laugh he could never reclaim, no matter how quickly he now moved to close the distance between himself and the family he had not known he possessed. "Henry," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion he made no attempt to hide. "Prepare the carriage. We leave for the southern coast within the hour."
"Of course, Your Grace."
Henry hesitated a moment longer, studying his employer's face with careful attention.
"May I ask what news the letter carried? To see you so thoroughly undone?"
Edmund looked up at the man who had served his family faithfully through every difficult turn of the past 5 years, and felt a laugh, disbelieving and joyful, break free from his chest, despite the tears gathering in his eyes. "I have a son, Henry," he said. "I have had a son for nearly 5 years, and I am only just now learning of it." Henry's composed expression finally cracked into something like genuine astonishment, followed quickly by a broad, unguarded smile. "Then we had best not delay a moment longer, Your Grace. You have 5 years of lost time to begin making up for." Edmund rode toward the southern coast that very day, his mind spinning through every possible reaction he might encounter upon arrival. Hope and fear and joy tangled together so thoroughly he could barely separate one feeling from another. He did not know what state he would find his marriage in after so many years of silence and separation. He did not know how Eleanor would receive him, whether her letter's warmth signaled genuine hope for reconciliation, or merely a mother's sense of duty, in finally revealing a truth too long withheld. He only knew that he could not spend one more day away from the family he had only just discovered he possessed, and that whatever awaited him at the end of this journey, he intended to face it with the same fierce determination that had once carried him through Vale's dangerous conspiracy, this time in pursuit of something far more precious than mere survival. The journey south took 4 days, and by the time Edmund's carriage finally rolled to a stop before the small coastal cottage Eleanor called home, his nerves had worn themselves ragged with anticipation. He stepped down onto the gravel path, straightening his coat with hands that were not entirely steady, and found himself facing a modest but well-kept house with a garden full of late spring flowers. So different from the grandeur of Collingford that for a moment he wondered if he had somehow arrived at the wrong address entirely. Then the front door opened, and Eleanor stepped out onto the small porch, and every doubt in Edmund's mind fell away at once. She looked older, in the particular way that years of quiet worry and solitary motherhood etched themselves gently into a person's face, but she was, if anything, more beautiful to him now than she had been on the day she left. Her expression a complicated mixture of hope and fear that mirrored exactly what Edmund felt in his own chest. "Edmund," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Eleanor." He crossed the distance between them, in a few long strides, stopping just short of reaching for her, uncertain, after so many years, what welcome he was entitled to. "I received your letter." "I know," she said, I did not truly believe you would come so quickly. I would have come the moment I finished reading it, if the carriage could have moved fast enough." They stood facing each other, neither quite certain how to bridge 5 years of silence and separation with mere words, until a small voice called out from behind Eleanor, curious and a little shy. "Mama, who is this?" Edmund's eyes moved past his wife to the small boy standing in the doorway, and the breath left his body entirely. William stood there in the afternoon light, dark hair falling across a forehead that was unmistakably, achingly familiar, brown eyes wide with cautious curiosity, as he studied the stranger who had arrived so suddenly at their quiet home. It was, Edmund thought, like looking at a small mirror reflecting his own childhood back at him across the years, every feature so clearly stamped with his own bloodline that any lingering doubt about the boy's parentage evaporated instantly. "William," Eleanor said softly, kneeling down to bring herself level with her son, though her eyes never left Edmund's face. "This is your father." The boy's eyes widened further, darting between his mother and the tall stranger standing frozen on the garden path, clearly trying to reconcile years of vague explanations about a distant, dangerous world, keeping his father away, with the sudden, overwhelming reality of that father's actual presence. Edmund knelt slowly, bringing himself down to the boy's height, his heart hammering with an emotion he had never expected to feel with such overwhelming force. "Hello, William," he said, his voice thick, despite his best efforts to keep it steady. "I am so very glad to finally meet you." William studied him for a long, serious moment, the particular unflinching evaluation only children seem capable of offering, before asking the question that cut straight through every careful, complicated adult feeling swirling around the reunion. "Are you going to stay this time?" The simple, direct honesty of the question struck Edmund with more force than any accusation an adult might have leveled at him. "Yes," he said, without a moment's hesitation. "I intend to stay for as long as you and your mother will have me." Something in the boy's careful expression softened slightly at that, though he remained cautious, understandably unwilling to fully trust a stranger who had appeared so suddenly after years of absence, however warmly that stranger now spoke. Eleanor watched the exchange with tears gathering in her eyes, and when William finally allowed himself a small, tentative smile, she felt something long clenched and guarded in her own chest begin, slowly, to loosen. They spent that first evening in careful, halting conversation, William gradually warming enough to show Edmund his small collection of carved wooden horses, a passion Eleanor explained had grown from stories she had told him about Collingford's stables. Edmund listened to every detail with rapt attention, hungry for every small piece of the years he had missed, and found himself laughing, genuinely and freely, for the first time in longer than he could easily remember. It was only after William had finally been coaxed to bed, exhausted from the excitement of the day, that Edmund and Eleanor found themselves alone together for the first real conversation either of them had truly wanted since his arrival. They sat in the small parlor, a fire crackling low in the hearth, and for a long moment neither spoke, the weight of 5 years of separation pressing heavily between them. "I am sorry," Eleanor said finally, breaking the silence first. "For the years of silence, for not writing sooner, for allowing pride and fear to keep William from you for so long. I have turned this apology over in my mind 1,000 times across the years, and it still feels inadequate to the harm it has caused. You are not solely to blame," Edmund said quietly. "I sent you away without full honesty, without trusting you enough to face the danger together, as partners, rather than as protector and protected. And afterward, when the danger had passed, I allowed my own hurt and pride to keep me from pursuing you more persistently, when your letters grew silent, rather than considering that something beyond simple abandonment might explain it." He told her then, for the first time, about the letter that had traveled to her aunt's northern estate and been misplaced in a forgotten drawer, about the years of assuming her silence meant a chosen distance, rather than a series of unfortunate accidents and misplaced correspondence, layered atop genuine fear for their son's safety. Eleanor listened with growing horror and grief as the full picture assembled itself between them. 5 years of pain, built on a foundation of stolen letters, forgotten drawers, and 2 proud, frightened people, each too wounded to reach across the silence, with enough persistence to break through it. "All this time," Eleanor whispered, "I believed you had simply moved forward without us, found relief in a quieter life, free of the complications I represented." and I believed you had chosen to remain away, perhaps grown to prefer independence over the uncertain, dangerous life of being my Duchess. Edmund reached across the space between them, taking her hand gently, relieved beyond words when she did not pull away. We have both been foolish, Eleanor, in ways that cost us 5 years we can never fully reclaim. Then let us not compound that foolishness by allowing more pride to keep us apart, now that the truth has finally surfaced, Eleanor said, her fingers tightening around his. I have missed you every single day of these 5 years, Edmund, more than I ever allowed myself to fully admit, even to myself. And I have loved you every single day, he answered, even through the anger and confusion of unanswered letters. Even when I tried to convince myself that moving forward without you might eventually become easier, it never did, not for a single day. They talked long into the night, filling in the missing years as best they could, sharing the fears and hopes and small daily moments each had experienced separately, and by the time dawn began lightening the sky outside the parlor window, something that had felt irreparably broken between them had begun, tentatively but genuinely, to mend. But the full resolution of their years apart would prove more complicated than one honest night of conversation could entirely settle. When Edmund returned to Collingford Hall 2 weeks later, bringing Eleanor and William with him at last, he discovered that his Aunt Margaret, believing him still resolved to seek an annulment given the deadline he had set the previous autumn, had already begun quiet inquiries into the legal process, convinced she was acting in the family's best interest during what she believed remained an ongoing, unresolved separation. The awkward, uncomfortable confrontation that followed, as Edmund arrived home with a wife and son Margaret had not known existed, threatened to unravel the fragile peace the family had only just begun rebuilding, forcing Edmund and Eleanor to confront not only their own healing, but the skepticism and awkward adjustment of a wider family and household who had spent 5 years believing their marriage effectively over. Margaret Ashworth stood frozen in the entrance hall of Collingford Hall, staring at the small boy holding tightly to Eleanor's hand, and for a long moment, no one in the grand hallway seemed to know quite what to say. Edmund, Margaret said finally, her voice carrying the particular strain of a woman trying to process information that upended everything she had believed to be true. You did not mention, in any of our correspondence, that the Duchess had returned. Nor, she added, her eyes moving pointedly to William, that you had apparently become a father. I learned of my son's existence only 2 weeks ago myself, Aunt Margaret, Edmund said, his arm resting protectively around Eleanor's shoulders. The circumstances of our separation were more complicated than either of us fully understood at the time, and I intend to explain everything, but not, I think, standing in the entrance hall as though we were strangers rather than family. Margaret's composure wavered further as the full weight of the situation settled over her, and Edmund could see her mind working rapidly through the implications, the annulment inquiries she had already quietly begun, the assumptions she had built her advice upon for months, all of it suddenly rendered not just premature, but deeply, embarrassingly mistaken. I have been making inquiries, she admitted slowly, regarding an annulment. I believed, given the length of your separation, and the deadline you yourself set last autumn, that you intended to pursue that path should no reconciliation occur. Then I am glad I arrived before those inquiries progressed any further, Edmund said, though not unkindly, understanding that his aunt had acted from genuine concern for the family's future rather than malice. There will be no annulment, Aunt Margaret. My wife has returned to Collingford, and my son will be raised here, acknowledged fully and properly as my heir. The household spent the following weeks adjusting to this dramatic and unexpected shift, and while most of the staff welcomed the return of their Duchess and the arrival of a young heir with genuine warmth, a lingering awkwardness persisted in certain corners, particularly among those who had grown accustomed, over 5 years, to speaking of the Duke's marriage as a quiet, sad failure, rather than a story still capable of finding its way toward happiness. Eleanor found the adjustment more difficult than she had anticipated, navigating a household that had continued operating in her absence, under routines and habits established without her, while simultaneously helping William adjust to a grand, unfamiliar home, so different from the small coastal cottage that had been the only world he had ever known. She found herself, in quiet moments, wondering whether 5 years of separation had changed her too fundamentally to ever fully settle back into the role of Duchess she had once occupied so briefly, before everything fell apart. You look troubled, Edmund observed one evening, finding her standing in the garden where he had first told her, all those years ago, that he intended to send her away for her own safety. The roses were in bloom again, the same variety she had been cutting, that long-ago afternoon, and the symmetry of the moment was not lost on either of them. "I am wondering," Eleanor admitted, "whether I still truly belong here, after everything. Whether the years have changed me too much to simply resume the life we once began together." Edmund considered her words carefully before answering. "I think," he said slowly, "that we are neither of us the same people who stood in this garden 5 years ago. You have raised our son largely alone, through fear and uncertainty, and grown stronger and wiser for it. I have spent 5 years learning, too late, the cost of choosing distance over honesty, and I hope I have grown wiser for that lesson as well. Perhaps we do not need to resume the life we once began, Eleanor. Perhaps we simply need to build a new one, informed by everything we have separately learned, together this time, with nothing held back between us." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, seeing in his face the same steady sincerity that had first drawn her toward genuine affection in the earliest days of their arranged marriage, tempered now by 5 hard years of separation and regret that had clearly taught him something real about the cost of choosing protection over partnership. "I would like that," she said softly. "A new beginning, built honestly this time." "Then let us begin it properly," Edmund said, and reached for her hand. The formal acknowledgement of William as Edmund's heir took place several weeks later, a ceremony attended by family and prominent members of the county society, all curious to finally witness in person the resolution of a mystery that had occupied gossiping tongues for years. Margaret, having fully accepted the reality of the reunited family, stood proudly beside her nephew and grandnephew throughout the proceedings, her earlier doubts entirely replaced by genuine warmth toward the boy who would one day inherit the title she had spent so many years worrying might pass to a more distant, less beloved branch of the family. William, now old enough to sense the significance of the occasion, even if he did not fully understand every ceremonial detail, stood beside his father with a solemnity that made Edmund's chest ache with pride, occasionally glancing up to check that his father remained close beside him, a small, reassuring habit that had developed quickly in the weeks since their reunion, as though the boy needed frequent confirmation that this time, his father truly intended to stay. That evening, after the formal celebrations had concluded and the last guests had departed, Edmund and Eleanor sat together in the same parlor where so many difficult conversations had once unfolded between them. William finally asleep upstairs after the excitement of his first grand family occasion. "Do you remember," Eleanor said quietly, "the promise I asked of you, the morning I left for my aunt's estate, that you would write the moment the danger passed and bring me home without delay?" "I remember," Edmund said. "And I remember failing to keep that promise as fully as I intended, through circumstances neither of us could have fully controlled." "I do not blame you any longer," Eleanor said, and found, saying the words aloud, that she genuinely meant them. "We were both caught in a web of misfortune and misunderstanding that neither of us built entirely on purpose. I only wish we had trusted each other enough, at various points, to push through the silence more persistently, rather than allowing pride to convince us that distance meant rejection." "Then let that be the lesson we carry forward," Edmund said, drawing her close against his side as the fire burned low in the hearth. "Whatever difficulties arise in the years ahead, and I suspect there will be some, given the particular chaos that seems to follow our family's history, let us face them honestly and together, rather than choosing separation out of a mistaken belief that distance offers protection." "Together," Eleanor agreed, resting her head against his shoulder, feeling for the first time in 5 long years that the word carried its full and proper weight, rather than existing only as a hopeful, distant promise. Outside, the summer evening settled peacefully over Collingford Hall, its grounds quiet and safe, in a way they had not been during the dangerous months of Vale's conspiracy, its halls once again filled with the sounds of a family finally, fully reunited. Upstairs, William slept soundly in a nursery that had waited 5 years for a child to occupy it, dreaming, perhaps, of the wooden horses he had brought with him from the coastal cottage that had been his first home, unaware of how close his parents had come to never finding their way back to each other at all, unaware of how many stolen letters and forgotten drawers and frightened, prideful choices had nearly cost them the very family now settling, at last, into the life they had always been meant to share. Edmund and Eleanor remained in the parlor long after the fire burned down to embers, neither quite ready to end a night that felt like the true beginning of everything they had lost, and were only now finally reclaiming. 5 years, one dangerous conspiracy, and one small, remarkable boy, later than either of them had ever planned. 10 years later, on a bright autumn morning, a young man of 15 stood at the edge of the Collingford stables, watching a groom lead out a spirited chestnut horse that had arrived from Ireland only the week before. William had grown tall and steady, carrying himself with a quiet confidence that mixed his mother's sharp intelligence with his father's calm sense of duty, and the years of separation that had once shaped the earliest chapter of his life had long since faded into a story he knew well, but no longer carried as a wound. "He is a fine animal," Edmund said, joining his son at the fence rail, silver now threading through his dark hair, though his bearing remained as steady as ever. "Your mother tells me you intend to ride him in the county race next month." "If you will allow it," William said, glancing sideways at his father with the particular respect that had grown between them across a decade of steady, unbroken presence. A respect built patiently through every ordinary day Edmund had made certain never to miss again. "I would not dream of stopping you," Edmund said. "Though I suspect your mother may have opinions on the matter. My mother," came Eleanor's voice from behind them, warm with amusement, "has already made her opinions known to the stable master, and expects both of you to listen carefully to his advice regarding safety, before either of you agrees to anything reckless." She crossed the yard to join them, still every bit the sharp, capable woman Edmund had fallen in love with all those years ago, though time had softened certain worries into a settled, contented peace that suited her well. Collingford Hall had long since returned to its former reputation as a stable, prosperous estate, the old rumors of a vanished Duchess replaced entirely by the far happier, far more accurate story of a family that had weathered great difficulty and emerged from it stronger for the honesty they had learned to practice with each other. They had, in the years since William's formal acknowledgement as heir, added 2 more children to their family, a daughter named Charlotte who had inherited her mother's fearless curiosity, and a younger son, Henry, named in quiet tribute to the steward who had served the family so faithfully through its most dangerous years. The household that had once felt so achingly empty during Eleanor's long absence now rang constantly with the noise and laughter of a full, thriving family, and Edmund often found himself pausing in ordinary moments, watching his children play across the same lawns, where he had once paced anxiously, awaiting news of Vale's conspiracy, marveling at how completely joy had reclaimed spaces once haunted by fear. Henry Fairfax, though gray and slower in his movements than in his younger years, remained a constant presence at Collingford, having never fully retired despite Edmund's gentle insistence that he had more than earned a quieter life. He took particular pride in teaching young William the finer points of estate management, passing along decades of accumulated wisdom with the patient, thorough care of a man who had watched this family survive its darkest chapter and wanted to ensure the next generation understood exactly what had been fought for and preserved. "You have done well, Your Grace," Henry said to Edmund one afternoon, watching William work through a set of accounts with careful concentration in the same study where the old letters about Vale's grievance had once been spread across the desk. "Better than I believe you gave yourself credit for in those difficult years." "We nearly lost everything, Henry," Edmund said quietly. 5 years apart, a son I did not know existed, a marriage built on silence and misunderstanding that very nearly became permanent. I do not think I deserve too much credit for eventually finding our way back to each other, when the finding took so painfully long. "Perhaps not," Henry agreed. "But you found your way back nonetheless, and more importantly, you learned from the finding. I have watched you these 10 years, Your Grace, and I have never once seen you choose silence over honesty with the Duchess again, not even when difficult matters arose. That, I think, deserves rather more credit than you allow yourself." Edmund considered this for a long moment, watching his son through the study window, now grown into a capable young man who would one day inherit everything Edmund had fought so hard to protect and preserve. He thought of Lord Vale, long since deceased in the distant colony where his transportation sentence had sent him, his name now little more than a cautionary footnote in the family's history, rather than the looming threat it had once represented. He thought of the stolen letter, the forgotten drawer, the years of assumed rejection that had cost his family so much unnecessary pain, All of it, eventually resolved, not through some dramatic reversal of fortune, but through the slow, deliberate choice both he and Eleanor had made to finally trust each other, with the full truth, however late that trust had arrived. Perhaps you are right, Edmund admitted finally, though I hope, for William's sake, that he never faces a test quite so severe as the one that nearly cost his mother and me everything. Every generation faces its own tests, Your Grace, Henry said, with the wisdom of a man who had served 3 generations of the Ashworth family by this point in his long career. I only hope, when William's test arrives, that he has learned enough from watching his parents' mistakes and eventual wisdom to choose honesty more quickly than either of you managed. That evening, the entire family gathered for dinner in the grand dining hall, a scene that would have seemed impossible during the darkest months of Eleanor's exile along the southern coast, when she had sat alone night after night, wondering if her husband had simply moved forward without her. Charlotte chattered excitedly about a litter of puppies born in the stables that week. Young Henry attempted, with limited success, to follow his older sister's rapid storytelling, and William listened with the patient amusement of an older brother well accustomed to his siblings' enthusiasm. Edmund watched his family across the long table, candlelight catching the warmth in Eleanor's eyes as she laughed at something Charlotte said, and felt a gratitude so deep it nearly stole his breath entirely. 5 years of separation, born from fear and pride and a series of unfortunate accidents neither of them could have fully anticipated, had once seemed like a wound too deep to ever properly heal. Yet here they sat, a decade later, a family built stronger for having survived that darkness, having learned, through painful experience, that love required honesty, even when honesty felt frightening, that protecting the people you loved sometimes meant trusting them with difficult truths, rather than shielding them from every possible danger. After dinner, as the children were gradually shepherded off to bed by patient nursemaids, Edmund and Eleanor found themselves alone once more, in the same parlor that had witnessed so many of their most important conversations across the years, the fire burning warm and steady in the hearth. "Do you ever think of those years apart?" Eleanor asked, settling comfortably against his side, a habit worn smooth and easy by a decade of shared evenings. "Often," Edmund admitted, though the memory no longer carries the same sharp pain it once did. "I think of it now mostly as a lesson, a reminder of how easily fear can masquerade as protection, and how much stronger honesty proves to be, even when it feels far more frightening in the moment." "I think of it the same way," Eleanor said softly. "And I think, too, of how grateful I am that we found our way back to each other, before the distance became truly permanent, before William grew too old to remember any life other than the one we eventually built together." "We were fortunate," Edmund agreed. "Fortunate, and eventually wise enough to recognize what mattered most, even after taking far too long to reach that recognition." Outside, the autumn evening settled peacefully over Collingford's grounds, the estate quiet and prosperous in a way that reflected the hard-won peace its family had finally achieved. The story of the Duke who had once required separation to protect his Duchess, never knowing she carried his heir throughout those difficult years apart, had long since transformed from a painful chapter of misunderstanding into the foundation of a deeper, more honest love than either of them had believed possible when their marriage first began, as nothing more than an arrangement between 2 old families settling old debts. They sat together in comfortable silence as the fire burned low, 2 people who had weathered danger, separation, and years of painful misunderstanding, to finally arrive at the honest, steady partnership they had always been capable of building, if only fear had not once convinced them that distance offered greater safety than trust. Their children slept soundly upstairs, secure in a home finally free of the shadows that had once haunted its halls, and Collingford Hall stood strong around them, a testament to a family that had nearly lost everything, and had chosen, in the end, to find its way home.